Hello everyone, I hope you're all well and enjoying the start of 2021. This video is going to be about Dover Castle and its importance in the struggle for power between King John and his rebellious barons after the failure of Magna Carta, which then encompasses the partial occupation of England by the French Prince Louis. Now, before we start, as with all of my videos, the sources I've used are going to be in the description underneath the video, so if you click on that, you'll be able to see where I got all of my information from, and you can fact check me if you want to, or if you want to go more in depth and you want to learn a bit more about what I'm talking about. So, in the 1180s, this guy, Henry II, started construction and fortification on one of the most strategically important buildings in England, Dover Castle. Before Henry II started the building of Dover Castle in the late 12th century, the site had been an Iron Age hill fort. There was a Roman settlement there, and there was an Anglo-Saxon fort there as well. And then when William the Conqueror came in 1066 across from Normandy, he started at Dover by fortifying the fort that he had already found. So this is William the Conqueror, King William I. And what he did was, after his victory at Hastings, he headed east, sacking and burning the towns of Hastings and Dover. And when he arrived at Dover, he found the fort on the hill, and it was very quickly surrendered to him. So it's very widely accepted that at Dover, William spent about 8 days. So he spent that pulling down the parts of the fort that were no longer fit for purpose and rebuilding. But no one's entirely sure whether he managed to build an actual proper castle, as we see today. So whether he spent the time reinforcing pre-existing buildings or laying foundations for a proper, like, Motte and Bailey castle, it's unsure. But obviously the main question about this video is why Dover Castle was put there. Why was Dover chosen as one of the most important places in England? It's very strategically important because it kind of guards the shortest crossing between England and continental Europe. You can still see the site of Dover Castle from France on a very clear day. It's a very short crossing, and it remains to this day the place where most people leave England to go to France, or France to come to England, whether that's on a ferry or underground through the Eurotunnel. So by the beginning of the 13th century, 20 years after Henry II started the construction and fortification of Dover Castle, Dover had, this is a quote, an enormous keep and a massive curtain wall, also fortified with projecting square towers encircling it. And this is important, this is very interesting, because in later centuries, castles that were built would have had, and still have, round towers, but Dover had square towers. The reason for progressing onto round towers is that in a siege, it's much more difficult to destroy a round tower, whether with a trebuchet or a cannon, because it's much more stable. Square towers, more often than not, would have fallen much more easily than a round tower if it was under siege. But Dover was constructed before the shift to round towers, which is why it has and still has square towers around the keep. So this here now on the screen is the Great Tower, which was the royal residence at Dover Castle, and it took about 10 years to build between 1180 and 1190. It cost approximately £4,000, which at the time accounted for between a quarter and a third of Henry II's yearly income, which was between £10,000 and £20,000 a year. And this is obviously a kind of ridiculously large monetary investment into Dover Castle, and it demonstrates to us, looking back now, just how important it was seen at the time, and for many centuries later. If the king is spending anywhere between a quarter and a third of his yearly income to build and fortify a castle, we can pretty much take it for granted that that was at the time seen as a very important site. This is now a bird's eye picture of Dover Castle, and what's interesting to note is that it has several concentric defensive walls. So the one around the outside, then an inner one surrounding the actual Great Keep. Dover Castle was the first European castle to have this defensive feature of several concentric walls, one within the other, which you can pretty clearly see in this picture here. So now, in 1216, which you might know as the year after the first Magna Carta between King John and his rebellious barons. So 1 year after that, in 1216, the barons had already realised that John was not and would never keep to his word, as he had said previously. They offered the English throne to the French Prince Louis, the Dauphin, because of how much they disliked King John. The French Dauphin landed in Kent, and he settled a large part of his army with a specific purpose to besiege and take and hold Dover Castle. The interesting thing is that when William the Conqueror came in 1066, he already held Dover by the time he moved up to London and to Winchester in order to kind of consolidate his power. But Prince Louis never managed to take Dover Castle, although he did arguably garner a lot of support in Winchester and London. He never took Dover, which might be one of the reasons why eventually he was unsuccessful, as we know. So Dover Castle was besieged for about 10 months by the French. Dover Castle had a relatively small number of knights, about 140, to protect the castle. And that was the subject of the French siege and a French sea blockade. Because obviously one of the main advantages of building a castle right on the sea coast is that you eliminate one of the fronts of attack. But it does mean that if your castle is under siege, you have to try and use the sea to get supplies into the castle. The French kind of blocked that with their sea blockade. So it was very difficult for the English knights within Dover Castle to supply themselves and to keep healthy. So one of the disadvantages, again, of the square towers is that you can more easily than a round tower mess with its foundations, because it has corners. If you eliminate one of the corners, the tower itself is much less stable. And that's what the French soldiers tried to do. They attempted to tunnel underneath some of the square towers in the castle walls to bring them down and therefore allow for a direct attack on the castle. The English defenders, led by someone called Hubert de Burgh, heard of the plan for the French to tunnel under the towers and dug their own tunnels underneath the French tunnels in order to kind of cut them off and to collapse the French tunnels underneath the castle walls. So in 1217, King John was now dead. The French Prince Louis had lost a lot of his support among the English barons because a lot of them were not so worried about the throne of England now because it had passed to Henry III, King John's son, who was only a small boy. And there was a naval battle between the French and the English just off the coast of Dover within sight of the castle. The English won, and it was at that point that Hubert de Burgh, who was the main defender of Dover Castle, branded it as the key of England. And like I said before, the importance cannot be overstated with the difference and similarities between William the Conqueror's invasion and the French Prince Louis's invasion of England. And one of them took Dover, one of them didn't, one of them was successful, the other was not. So shortly afterwards, Prince Louis, the French Dauphin, came to a peace agreement with Henry III. He left England with his troops and he never returned. Now there's a lot more to say specifically about Dover Castle, and even within the realm of just the 13th century. About 50 years later, it was the subject of another siege during the Second Baronial War, which had Simon de Montfort. And I think I'm going to do another video about that, because it's just as interesting as this, if not more so. And Dover Castle remained a very key feature of England, both in the defence of it and the architectural landscape. Up until today, really, it was even used in World War II as like a secret government base. They used some of the tunnels underneath the castles. So I could do a video about that as well. So thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something about Dover Castle. If you know anyone who might be interested in this or in medieval history, please feel free to send them the video. Make sure to like it if you enjoyed, and please do subscribe if you would like to see more content like this. Thank you very much.